Part 4, and what is the relevance of these ideas about virtual reality to magic? Now, in part 1, when I talked about the original idea of artificial intelligence as I heard it from Frank George in 1960, I pointed out that reductionist ideas which seem to sort of take the magic out of the world, I saw a way of sort of reversing them and finding that actually I could use those ideas to bring magic back into the world. And the particular initial example I gave was the idea of reincarnation. Now, according to the physical model of the world, reincarnation is a non-starter, because how can all this information, this stuff, even if you call it a soul, there's so much information there, how can that sort of travel through space and end up in and time and space and end up in a different body? And the answer is there's no physical way we can see that happening. But if I think of myself as pure information, then it's rather a different matter that information should turn up in another place. One person might read words made flesh in one place and say, how could you be reading it? Because I've got it. But of course, it's another copy of it in another place. So it sort of tipped the balance there. Now, the general relevance for magic is that the virtual reality notion of the world has added a new world model. As I explained it on the cover of the original edition of Words Made Flesh, I said that I related it to Crowley's idea of Isis, Osiris and Horus. I said the original view of the world is a world of matter, Mata, the mother. And then there's the world of energy, which I associate with the father, or Osiris. And now I'm proposing a world of information, which I relate to Horus, the child. But more generally, see, there's also a view of the world which is based on spirit. Now, some of the other chaos magicians have talked about this following my introduction of the idea of the world of information. I think Pete Carroll and Ralph Tegtmeyer talk about, the spirit model, the matter model, the energy model, and now the information model. See, the world of the matter model, that the world is made up of this physical substance, and that's all there is, doesn't leave much room for magic. That model is very powerful because it has worked hard to make us believe in it. There's a lot of proof, there's a lot of scientific demonstrations, and so it's very easy to believe in that model. And you might say, how can you believe in any other model in that case? And this is where, I'm not going to go into depth here, but in earlier videos, and in particular in the book My Years of Magical Thinking, I point out that magical belief is not the same as scientific or religious belief. Because in science and religion, if you believe something, you believe it is absolutely true, and therefore it has to work hard to win your belief. And the physical model has worked hard to win our belief. All the experiments of science and that, it's done that work, and so a lot of people believe it as the absolute truth. Just think how hard Christianity would have to work if it was going to be believed by a skeptic like Richard Dawkins. It would have to do a lot of things. For example, it would have to try to convince him of the historical reality of the gospel, the Bible stories. It wouldn't be just enough to sort of find some manuscript talking about it. it would have to be things like accepted historians of the time, or as close as possible to that time, people who already are respected and believed. You would have to find something written by them which says, I've investigated this story of this Christ Messiah person, and I've asked a lot of people, reliable witnesses from the time, and it really does seem to be that this is the truth, and so on and so forth, and these miracles happened. Okay, that's just beginning, that's sort of quite impressive. But of course, Dawkins wouldn't be convinced just by that. He would also need things like a laboratory test that prayers can help to heal, things like that. And there might even be some question of somehow a communication from God himself that was accepted. Christianity would have to work very, very hard to be believed by Richard Dawkins. And that's the nature of scientific and religious belief. Now, but what I pointed out is that magical belief is different. Magical and artistic belief is not something that convinces you. It is a gift you give. And I give the example that I believe in equal rights for women. But the proof that women have equal rights on this planet is actually thinner on the ground than the proof of the existence of the truth of Christianity or the existence of fairies. I would say there's no real solid evidence that women have equal rights on this planet. So how can I believe it? Because I believe it as a magician or an artist. I give a gift of belief to that. Now, that might seem very sort of, in other words, you just kid yourself. But the way it works, taking magic, just take example of the tarot pack. If you give that gift of belief that the tarot pack contains or somehow channels wisdom that can help you with your life, it may begin, or else that the person on the stage acting out a Shakespeare play, you give the gift of belief in that reality. It may seem initially that you're sort of doing all the work. Okay, I'm really going to try and fool myself that this is true. But what happens is if you genuinely give that gift of belief, it begins to pay you back. In the case of the Shakespeare play, you have an amazing experience which could actually be life-changing with a really good performance. And in the case of the tarot, you begin to get results which are more and more impressive. And so you move closer towards the tarot actually making you believe. But it begins with that initial gift. So, although we're being brought up with the matter model of the universe, we can get into these other models. Now, a popular one with New Agers and people like that is the energy model. That behind this facade of matter, there's actually flows of energy. And so, for example, if you accept that model, then ley lines begin to make sense. There are flows of energy through the country, and you can then go and sit in those places and sort of, by giving it a gift of belief, you can tune into those energies and you can learn to do sort of earth energy magic. Or else you take the Chinese medicine view of energy meridians running through the body. And again, if you can sort of get into that belief, you can then begin to work healing by operating with those energy meridians. Now, of course, the oldest of these other models is the spirit model. That, okay, there's this world of matter, but it's a sort of precipitate that has come out of a greater world of spirit which lies behind it all. And so, if you can contact that world of spirit, things like that, you can then have an effect on the material world. And what I was proposing is that the model where we can see the world we're in now is actually a sort of illusion created by information. In other words, it's a virtual reality in the modern terminology. And now, that actually relates very well to the spirit model, because you see the spirit model says there's this great world of spirit, and out of it is condensed a world of matter that we live in, but behind it all there is this great world of spirit, as it were, working it. Now this is actually exactly parallel with the information model. There is this great program, this great information process, and out of it comes this illusion that we are living in, when all that other stuff is working behind the scenes. So it's actually a sort of a new version of the spirit model. And in that model, something like reincarnation, why should it not happen? You know, why should the information in this particular model of a person not appear in another person, in some future time, different place? Certain things which are very hard to justify in the material world suddenly become very easy to understand in an information world. But there's something which is particularly powerful about this model, and that is the connectedness of the universe. You see, one of the strongest criticisms that the believers in the material model have about anything magic, and I take the example of divination, you know, astrology is nonsense. How could, when you're born, the position of Jupiter, you know, millions of miles away in space, a piece of gas giant, how can that have any effect on the baby that's born? Or even more stupid, horary astrology. You think of a question, and you, as you word that question, you draw the chart of that moment, and you say that Mars, Pluto, these planets are having some relevance to this question. It's absolutely ridiculous. As is tarot. You want to know some question about your life, and so you shuffle a pack of cards randomly and spread them out. What's the connection? There is none. Because this world is made of independent things, and that the shuffle of the pack is pure chance. It's got nothing to do. Now you see, those very qualities, independence and chance, are the qualities which are so expensive in a program. I don't know what people do now in order to have a random number generator, but in my days, the best they could do is to get some very, very fine calculation and really push it to the limits of the actual physical limits of the computing system, so that you get some sort of, as it were, shake, and you get numbers which lie outside the determinism. In any sort of computer model, it all evolves from certain equations in a very complex way, I should say. But the basic equations are there, and to have the planet Jupiter operating under a completely different set of equations is nonsense. It would be so ridiculous. And have every single phenomenon operating separately, say, hopeless use of resources. So we are all part of one great program. And this really completely turns the tables on the scientific viewpoint, the physical viewpoint, which says, how could there be any connection between the random shuffling of cards at one moment and the big question you got in your mind? Because it turns the table and says, how could there possibly be no connection between any two things happening at the same instant? Because they're all evolving from the same sets of equations. Now this actually poses a different challenge. How is it that we don't see this connection? Why is it not so absolutely obvious? I only have to look up at the sky and look at Jupiter and know the answer to my problems. And that is an interesting question in itself, which I have tried to deal with. One of the ways I've dealt with is raising the question of the role of consciousness. I think I'll come back to that at the end, because it's a big question in itself. So, when I the very first people I spoke to this idea of my virtual universe were the chaos magicians, because they were the people who were listening to me at the time. I wrote it up in the magazine Aquarian Arrow, which was a sort of general pagan, or neo-paganism they called it at the time, thing. But I gave talks at some of the very early chaos conferences, and they caught on. And this sort of new term, Cybermagick, came up. The idea of using the idea that we are information, and that a spell is a sort of like an information virus you're putting into the system, and so on. The whole theory of that, I didn't really go into it any further. Other people took it up, and they say that is referred to by the chaos magicians as Cybermagick, or that's a term that I've heard of. And what I did in, I think it was 1985, I decided this idea was interesting enough that people outside the magic community might be intrigued by it, the idea that we could be living in this. You see, the unfortunate thing was we didn't have the word virtual reality. I'd called it a sort of computer modelled universe. And so I wrote this book, Words Made Flesh, the first draft, and I couldn't get any publisher interested. I did actually at that stage have a friend who was a literary agent who passed me on to publishers, and I said, this is an ideas book, something to explore. And they said, people don't like ideas, you'll never get this published. And so what I did is I thought, well, I'll do what I did before, I'll publish it myself. And so I redrafted it, more directed towards the people I knew, the magic world. And so there's more about magic in that than the general public might like. But it is still a book that talks about AI and religion, AI and science, AI and society, and those other categories. So that's why the book took that form. Now, going back to the question of consciousness, there's a lot of talk in the sort of New Age science circles of the role of consciousness and whether it's something that can't be explained scientifically. Self-awareness, consciousness. And my take on it was along these lines. When are you most conscious? And I suggest it's when you witness a miracle. If, as you're watching this screen, suddenly it turned into a block of granite in front of your eyes, you would go, what? You would touch it, you'd look around, is anything else happening in the room? You would suddenly be thrown into the sort of absolute in-the-moment awareness that you hope to achieve by exercises like mindfulness. If something incongruous, magical happens, you are right there. And I've given this example in earlier videos about the time I saw a ghost and how I stared at it and I didn't move, and the ghost melted back into the patterns, of swirly patterns of a curtain behind me, and my mind said, that's all it was illusion, those swirly patterns. But what I argued was that if that was the case, why can't I see it again in the way that most of these optical illusions, you could, once you've seen the illusion, you could then see both, go to, and I couldn't. I'd normalized it, and that made me suspicious. So what I suggest is that if a universe evolved oh dear, I'm going to have to explain the evolutionary death. I have to go back to that. If a universe evolved, the reason it would evolve consciousness is as a debugging mechanism. Now, no information system is absolutely perfect. There are bugs. And if you have conscious entities who notice that something is wrong, and then their mind sort of normalizes it, the way mine did with that ghost, or tried to, then it's a debugging mechanism for that information system. And therefore, consciousness would tend to evolve in a virtual reality. Yes, I see I'm going to have to go back a step now, because I talked in the previous one about the different ways a virtual reality might form. You know, to be made for a scientific experiment, to be made to save the world from overpopulation, different models, and then there was my Cathar model, where it's made for one purpose and then taken over by Satan for another purpose. But I think I've referred to this in Words Made Flesh, but certainly in my Years of Magical Thinking. Do we need a creator behind it? You know, a race of angels deciding to make this thing, or a higher civilization wanting to work out whether the laws of physics it's determined actually work? And I came to the conclusion we didn't even need that. And the way I did it was this. I begin with something I can believe in. And again, not something which necessarily is totally proved for me, but I can give a gift of belief to it. And I can give that gift of belief to this idea that life was created in a sort of chemical soup. You know, the early days of planet Earth, there was all these chemicals slopping around, and there were probably electric thunderstorms and things like that. And over millions of years, a few chemicals lined up in particular ways, just by chance, forming crystals. A regular pattern, repeat, 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 and crystals grew. And another sort of pattern emerged, which we call, you know, amino acids and things like that, which then organize themselves into simple cellular life. And then the simple cellular life organizes itself into more complicated, until eventually emerged intelligent beings out of that chemical soup. Now, I just extrapolated that to an information soup. People say, what's an information soup? I can understand a chemical soup, but how can it be? Well, if you took that chemical soup and you wrote down the, all the information in it, you know, what molecules were made of, and this, that and the other, and how they could interact and all that sort of stuff, you've got an information soup. And out of this information soup emerged intelligent life. All I'm saying is that there's another sort of thing that could emerge out of an information soup. That is, certain information systems, programs or whatever, which model a reality. And so, just as the creatures that arise out of a chemical soup compete for resources, you know, and that leads to evolution of life, these programs evolving in information soup, they would compete for processing resources. And so universes would begin to emerge as emergent phenomena within this information soup, given endless amounts of time. And we happen to be one universe that has emerged successfully out of that information soup. And it has certain characteristics. Now, the physicists know more about this. You know, certain physical constants have to be very, very accurately just what they are in order for this universe to survive. Well, our universe is one of those winners. And I also suggest in my model that one of the survival mechanisms is consciousness, because within this great thing which is running all the time, there are now points of awareness which can notice if there are bugs in the software and explain them away, in other words, normalize them. And so that gives it greater stability, and that is the role of consciousness. And so magic is a question of, can you hold that consciousness, and instead of normalizing, can you allow the magic to stay? And so that's another model of magic which I proposed. I think I'm going to stop there. I mean, this gets a bit complicated, but what I just wanted to show was that an idea which for a lot of sort of pagans and people like that might seem like the absolute end of magic. You know, we're living in a great big computer. Oh yeah. Actually, if you explore it imaginatively, it opens up all sorts of possibilities. And I don't say it's any better than the spirit model or the energy model or the spirit energy. Well, I think it's better than the matter model. I said, okay, that's it. So I'm not saying it, I just say, here's a whole new model you can play with. Because if you can enter into a model which is different from the matter model, all those other models allow things to happen which can't happen in the matter model. And the information model is another one that allows things to happen that can't happen in the matter model. And therefore, it's a useful tool to live magically.